I hated Los Angeles probably from the moment I was able to understand what a city was. I always felt like I was supposed to be in New York City, even though I didn't know anything about it, except Beverly Hills was filled with New Yorkers. This was before Miami was a big deal. I grew up in a home where there was no art, there was no music, there was nothing really cultural that went on or that we were exposed to. Whatever I learned or whatever I saw, really I learned as I got to high school and my friends and whatever. But I think some of these things are just in you. My mother told me that when I was 3, she would read me a story and I would look at all the pictures. I couldn't read, but I would memorize the story, and as I turned the pages, I would know what was on each page. So in terms of any visual things, it was that, and it was the first television sets that were whatever. I just was always just drawn to it. I have no idea why. Beverly Hills, when I grew up there, my first novel, I mean, I always start with place. So there are my California novels, then there are my New York novels, and there are my Newport, Rhode Island novels, and now there's Miami novels. But Beverly Hills then was a village, and it was made up almost entirely. And there were 2 layers, by the way. There's Santa Monica Boulevard was the dividing line. If you lived above the railroad tracks, so there was still, you were well-to-do, and if you lived below, that was the people that wanted to live above, and whatever. It was a whole different world. But my neighborhood was like a movie show or television show. I mean, I grew up with, everybody, everybody's kids. Dean Martin, Lana Turner, the Marx Brothers, Jack Benny, Milton Berle, Red Skelton, you name them. I either went to school with their kids, or I trick-or-treated at their houses, or I'd see them walking around the village, because Beverly Hills then was still a village. It was a very nice village, but it was not glitzy the way it is now. And it was mainly families. And most of the families were either the sons and daughters of first-generation immigrants, mostly Jewish, but not entirely. The crossover was the motion picture industry. But with creative people, that doesn't become a factor. So I wasn't even aware of that. I was always drawn to anybody that was in the movie business. And from my freshman year at Beverly Hills High School, the 20th Century Fox was right next door with oil wells. You could climb over the fence, you were on the back lot. So our student productions had every big producer and movie star and whatever. And somehow at 14, I auditioned for the talent show and did a monologue from The King and I started getting calls from, movie producers and whatever. So I think that certainly my first few novels that were set there are dealing with Beverly Hills then, and then as I got older, and even after I moved to New York, my last California novel was set there, were about that. My father at some point, he was a real estate developer. Most of the families that weren't in the movie business, the sons just went in the father's business. Everybody skipped a step. So they were, kids that had never done anything, driving Corvettes to school and going into their father's windshield wiper business or Venetia blind deal. It wasn't very glamorous. And then there was the movie industry. I was in love with the movies from the first time I ever saw one, and television. And I think that became my education. There wasn't any other place to get it from. I was not going to get it from my parents who, my father just worked and screamed at everybody, and my mother just tried to avoid the chaos. So whatever I learned, I just had to learn myself. And I see what, I certainly saw where the gaps are, and I was basically always hungering for that kind of experience. So when I read about writers that grew up in these incredibly creative families, or the mother was a singer, or you know, the father painted, or they hunted, or they, you know, did anything like that, you know, and I've still never slept in a tent. I have never camped. You know, none of those things were part of our life. It was pretty, you know, it was pretty standard fare for the, you know, the 50s in Los Angeles. The old architecture you talk about, well, first of all, the way Los Angeles is laid out, there's no center. Beverly Hills was a little enclave. Even to get to the beach, it's not like Miami where the water's everywhere, was a 20-mile drive, really, you know. And so water wasn't even part of it. And most of the architecture were houses that people that were affluent built, that were certainly not works of great architecture. And the Spanish-style houses were sort of looked on as like, if you live there, you can't afford a really nice house. So I certainly didn't get any elevated taste from any of that. I mean, I don't really know. I think you're born with a certain set of characteristics. You talk about nature or nurture. That must have come from the nature part, because I certainly didn't get the other parts there. And it was an interesting place to grow up for an odd, you know, sort of creative kid. I starred in all the plays at Beverly Hills High School with people like Richard Dreyfuss and Bonnie Franklin and people like that, and I sort of, you know, that was sort of what I saw. I had a lot of English teachers and the drama department that saw something in me. Certainly my parents wouldn't have seen it in me. They just wanted me to marry a nice Jewish doctor or lawyer and live next door and breed, you know, that was what I was supposed to do. So the rest of it came from some great hunger. I mean, I wrote my way through everything, through a lonely childhood, and I read.